Hello, I'm Eliezer Yudkowsky on bloggingheads.tv, research fellow for the Singularity Institute of Artificial Intelligence, and with me is
Adam Frank from the University of Rochester, Department of Physics and Astronomy.
And we're here today to take on part 2 of our previous discussion on religion, faith, spirituality, and in particular whether the religious experience is compatible with science. To review the basic point of debate, if you were to take sort of 4 different possible positions on religion and science, one is we're going to keep all the religious scripture and all the religious assertions about how the universe works and throw away science. This would be the creationist position. Then we're going to sort of say that the religious facts the religious beliefs and the scientific beliefs are compatible. God created the world through evolution or something like that. Then there's a notion that we're actually going to give up on the religious beliefs but keep the religious experiences, the sense of mystery and awe at the universe, and say that this is compatible with science. And then there's the position that you should just throw away the entire religious mistake and start over. So Adam Frank is arguing for the... Sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Please continue.
Adam Frank is arguing for the compatibility of religious experience and scientific experience, and I'm with the start over crowd. Adam, if you think that this needs to be redescribed in some way, by all means, go ahead.
Well, I think as we go on, I would like to, I'm not completely comfortable with that formulation, but it's a good starting point at least, and as we go on, I think we'll see some of the differences. But I guess what I'd like to ask for you is that fourth position, the idea that, to start over and just, scrap the whole thing. If you could articulate that a little bit more. In particular, I guess what I would ask is, given the fact that so many people come to meaning in their lives, especially to thoughtful members of religious communities. And again, I want to emphasize that I am not a believer. I'm not a member of a church. I would consider myself an atheist. But to thoughtful members of religious communities, how do you address them in some sense? And their sense that they find meaning in their lives through their spiritual practice or being part of religion?
I'd say you can have exactly the same meaning without the spiritual practice, without the religion. The meaning never came from your religion in the first place. It's just something that's built into you and was from the beginning. And that the whole idea that you need religion or even vaguely defined spirituality to come to in order to get meaning was simply a false advertising practice on the part of religion.
But what about people who recognize that their scriptures or their tradition does not describe or explain the universe in any way, but that whatever documents or mythologies that they draw meaning from, that those have in them a wisdom that they find useful or meaningful in their life? I mean, how is it that you say to them, well, you think you're getting meaning, but you're not really getting meaning?
Well, first of all, you think you're getting meaning, but you're not really getting meaning is a perfectly legitimate thing to say. I mean, you could have someone who's deeply in love with their wife or husband and believes that this depends on their being a good Zoroastrian or something, and yet in point of fact that's simply built into them as a human and has nothing to do with Zoroastrianism. So you think you're getting meaning from this, but you're not, is a perfectly legitimate thing to say. And furthermore, even if, first of all, I think that people are going to tremendously overestimate the sheer writing quality of their sacred books because they're supposed to believe that they're high quality. But show me the single bit of religious scripture that approaches the literary quality of Lord of the Rings, and yet even though there's much that is wise as well as much that is unwise in Lord of the Rings, and it's this amazing literary quality book, you don't find people wearing little rings around their neck in memory of Frodo.
Well, I think that first of all, let's go back to this point of meaning. I mean, you're saying that someone derives meaning from the love that they find for their spouse. That meaning does not come from a set of pre-assumed statements about the world. The love that they feel brings a fullness to their life. And so, that their meaning, in some sense, is part of their experience of the world and their experience through others, their experiences through their practices, maybe making dinner with their spouse every night. And so there's not some sort of previous metaphysics that they draw meaning from. I mean, I understand what you're saying when we're talking about perhaps the first or second approach to science and religion, where there's a set of explanations which either have to be rejected or accepted. But I think this is from our last discussion, I thought this was important, that we have to distinguish between, religion as a bringer of explanations, as a way of articulating statements about the world that either are true or not true, and then the context in which people draw from religion or science in order to get a sense of meaning in their life. And it seems strange to say, to someone who, again, is very thoughtful about their religious practice, who recognizes perhaps that their scriptures were never intended as, cosmology or as medicine, but still
never intended? That sounds like a false factual claim. These things were intended as cosmology and medicine.
Well, when I say that
now we're using them differently, but...
Well, that these people, what a thoughtful person, my hypothetical thoughtful person in their religion understands that as time has progressed and society has progressed, that aspect of those scriptures are no longer viable. That the use of scriptures for those ways, it made sense if this was 2000 BC, but it no longer makes sense anymore. But that doesn't mean that there is not wisdom and truth, human truths, to be found in those stories. So, for example, you asked me about the literary quality of stories from the Old Testament last time. Remember, we were talking about was it all blood and guts? And so there was one story I thought that I love in particular that I thought I might raise and just, I think actually, in fact, you would actually like this story quite a bit. And the story I would choose is actually the book of Job. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to explain to you why I think you would love the book of Job, and it actually speaks directly to your sensibilities. So the book of Job actually has two parts. There's the beginning when Satan says to God, "Hey, look at your follower there, Job. He's such a good guy. Let's put him to the test." Right? And
these two actors are equally evil. The person who offered the bet and the person who accepted the bet, they're equally evil. But let's go on.
Right. So let's go on. So the point of actually of looking at Job is actually scholars like Stephen Mitchell have pointed out that there's two stories there. There's that stuff that gets wrapped around, like many things in any of these spiritual scriptures, whether they're Christian or Islamic or Hindu. You'll find they were written at different times. The really beautiful poetry of Job comes when Job starts to having all this horrible stuff happens to Job, right? He gets the boils, he loses his family, he loses his crops, and his friends come and say, "Oh, Job, you should curse. How can you? What did you do wrong?"
And Job, of course, is a metaphor for all of us as we suffer through the sheer pointless randomness inflicted on us by reality.
Exactly. And then at the end, right, what happens is finally Job says, "All right, enough. God, what did I do?" He rails against God, right? And then, God appears in the whirlwind or appears to him. And these beautiful lines where God says, "Hey, where were you? Where were you when I laid down the foundation of the world? Where were you when I taught the antelope to calf and knew when her time was ready?" I mean, those lines are so beautiful and evocative. And really, as with any of these documents, one is free to interpret them. And one, as you say, one of the beautiful things about this story is about suffering in the face of no meaning, is suffering without explanations. And at the end, right after, God goes through all of this and explains to, Job, or not explains to Job, points out to Job
bullies him.
That he
the
was...
word you're looking for is bully.
Well, again, but no, wait a minute.
You were around when the universe is created, so I get to give you boils? What? If this were not religious scripture, if this were some kind of movie on TV that we
Hold
were
it, Alexa, let me finish. Let me come to the conclusion
sure,
and the different ways one can interpret it, right? Now, at the end, after, God sort of points out to Job that the universe is structured the way the universe is structured, Job is silent. That's all Job can be, is silent. And this metaphor, Alexa, let me finish. I have to come to the end. Now, this can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Many people find a great beauty in this story because it is exactly that sense of there is suffering and there is travail, and in some sense we are part of the universe and we're stuck with it. But even for you, as a hardcore reductionist, there's a way of interpreting it, which actually Ursa Goodenough, who's a biologist who wrote the Sacred Depths of Nature, you can interpret it scientifically, which is this. This is the world you get. You know, maybe it's made of just little atoms, and that's it. Deal with it. This is the world you are born into. You can rail against it, but as Feynman says, you don't like this universe? Go find another. So there is great wisdom in that story, as a human story, expressing countless generations of human beings facing suffering, facing just the presence in the world with all of its travails, and how to come to terms with it when there is no hand to hold. So again, that story, and that the poetry in that story is truly beautiful, which is why so many people of all different approaches to religion, even people like myself who are not religious, still find beauty in its poetry.
Tolkien's got beautiful poetry. And Tolkien, if you read him carefully, has some unfortunate assumptions built into his world. The orcs are always lawful evil or always chaotic evil. I forget what the expression is. But, you know, there's these little brutish creatures running around. It's always okay to kill them because they're always the bad guys. You know, and Aragorn, you know, he's not democratically elected. He's just the heir, so he gets to be king. Things like that. And if you look at the assumptions of Job, it's immensely worse, of course. You know, you've got this God decides to ruin this guy's life, killing off dozens of innocent bystanders on a bet. And then, when Job has the temerity to complain about this, bullies him into silence by saying, I'm bigger and more powerful and knowledgeable than you. Shut up. This is an unabashedly dreadful story. And the fact that it's written in wonderful poetry doesn't excuse that any more than if Das Kapital had been written in wonderful poetry. You know, the problems with Tolkien's moral assumptions cannot be excused by the beauty of Tolkien's poetry. And the people who analyze Tolkien, you know, understand this. But the people who analyze Job, because it's a religious book, because so many other people think that it was written by God, even though they themselves don't written by God, they give it a pass. They refuse to apply their own moral faculties. Their morality analysis off switch has been flipped. This is the very danger of religion.
Aleitzer, you're choosing one interpretation and you're ignoring all the other interpretations of the book of Job that people, again, who are non-religious, who have no belief in God, still find the beauty in that story, the wisdom in that story, which is, in some sense, thy will, not mine, whether thy will is just the, meaningless universe of atoms. You're saying that interpretation cannot be chosen. That wisdom
you wouldn't choose. You wouldn't choose that interpretation.
You wouldn't choose, but many other people do and have found their wisdom in it. And that's the point I'm saying. First of all, you're saying there was nothing... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. What I'm trying to say here is not that I wouldn't choose that interpretation of Job. I'm saying even if you offer me that interpretation of Job, I still reject the content of it. Because there is no God, because there is no one here but us, we are not helpless victims being told by some higher power to shut up. We can change the world. We can cure smallpox. You don't see many people walking around with, suffering from horrible boils anymore, and that's because we have medicine, and the reason we have medicine is that the boils are not part of a divine plan. They are not laid down by some higher power since the creation of the universe. They are pointless randomness, and when we came into our power of technology, we cured it, and there was no higher power to stop us or even rebuke us for its being unwise. And again, the wisdom of the story is no greater than the wisdom and the poetry of Tolkien. I can challenge it as an equal. I am not on my knees before it in helpless reverence. I can write better stories myself.
Anybody who has stood before or sat by the bedside of their child, hoping that the drugs that have been administered will work, when sometimes they don't, has understood the moment of coming against the world. God, not God, that's a choice, but coming against the world and its uncertainty. And that is the poetry of that story is what expresses it brings meaning to them. Because whether or not they choose to have a belief in a God or not have a belief in a God, what that story illustrates is our place against the world, and that's why people find meaning. Now, you may not choose it, because one of the question we're asking here is not your reaction to the story, but, people's reaction to the story over history and why those stories endure. And the reason, and why you may want to throw everything out and start over again. But in these stories, people have found great meaning and comfort because on one level, at least, they express profoundly human truths. They don't have to be attached to, and this is what I mean when I think about thoughtful, a thoughtful believer. They don't have to be attached to an Old Testament vision of a God. So that's why these stories, that's why throwing it out and starting over again is, in some sense, it's an illusion, because how will you make that happen? Are you going to re-educate everyone? Are you going to, stand out in the street and argue for an atheist vision? I mean, doesn't atheism then just become another Protestant form, a missionary form, trying to convince people that its interpretations are better?
We've got questions piling up here, so if I can
Let's roll back.
Okay, so the first point is, does the Book of Job get any special treatment because people once believed that it was written by God? Or are we going to sell it in the fiction section alongside Tolkien and hold it to exactly the same standards that we hold Tolkien in terms of poetry, in terms of hidden moral assumptions, no more, no less? There's the question of, if we grant the Book of Job any treatment other than as fictional poetry, what kind of consequences does that have for us? What kind of side effects? And then you're asking the question of, what do you do about it, which is a whole other topic. But there I would say that we have to separate the question of building the new human meaning as if religion had never been versus the problem of weaning people off their old religions. Atheism is good. Atheism you might consider as the topic of analyzing the old mistakes and trying to explain them to people, but then the topic of building a new human meaning around coming into our power technologically and going out and conquering the galaxy, etc. These are sort of separate topics.
Well, they are, and I think, but you know what? They're really quite related in many ways, because I think we both have an interest in the human future. We've both written on the human future. You, in particular, with artificial intelligence, and I, in my book, writing about the bottleneck, the moment in history that we are now facing, becoming a planetary species, and our use of running into the limits of what the planet can give. And in both cases, well, it's certainly, I'm interested in the language of spirituality, because I feel, again, inventing something from scratch not only doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's bound to fail because it's been tried before and it doesn't work very well. We carry these meanings with us, whether we want to or not, and they will make their appearances, whether we want to or not. It's like trying to say to somebody, somebody in Hollywood, tell a story that's never been told before.
There's an awful lot of stories that have never been told in Hollywood, but let's not go into that part.
Well, if you know them, you could make a lot of money on it, because that's why so many of them are bad.
No, you can't, because you would have to get Hollywood to tell them, and this is a task of difficulty roughly comparable to, well, I don't know. It's something that's physically possible but never been done. Right. Never mind. From scratch, does that mean that the Book of Job was never written, that it has no causal effects left in the universe? No. But there's still such a thing as having a watershed moment where you say, oops, where you lose the unquestioning reverence that you once had, where it becomes possible, not just in theory, but in psychological practice, for you to say, is this wrong? Yes. And do something different and better. And this ability to have the watershed moment of just saying, oops, I was wrong, I was completely wrong, I admit it, I apologize, I'm not going to cling to the error, I'm just going to let go and let it float away. This is what distinguishes the practice and feelings of science, where you say, okay, Newtonian mechanics was wrong, relativity is right, I give up. I'm not going to cling on to it. I'm not going to say, but I was right on a purely spiritual level. I'm just going to say, oops. And this is the watershed. And this watershed moment is the as I see it, critical distinction between scientific practice and feeling and religious practice and feeling. And that's what I would advocate with respect to Job.
Okay, so but what I think that the problem here again is you thinking that this aspect of religion or spirituality or people finding turning to a sense that there's a spiritual dimension to their lives, pursuing it, an endeavor in those directions, is about explanations. It's about explanations for the world, as if people, as if the book of Job and its story were somehow an account of Newtonian mechanics, which then can be proven false, and then someone would say, "Oh, well, I'm going to give up on the story of Job, and now I'll take this new poem that was written." People,
you don't.
The question here is context, and what people find in these stories, and the reason why there will be a continuity, and what one can hope for, I hope, is that people develop forms of spiritual practice that are non-dogmatic, that are non-dogmatic, and that have are not literalist. Because people will turn to this to find meaning in their lives, because we need meaning in our lives. And one of the things I argued in the book was that science can play a role in this. Science, the beauty and power of science, the narratives.
I certainly agree that science can play a role in this. What I don't agree is that religion and spirituality can play a role.
Why? That's like saying that we should do away with ballet because we can run faster. If ballet is a bad example of running, so forget about ballet and everything. Why do people go to ballet? Why do people go to the arts? Because it gives them
this
a
is social
broader
proof.
sense.
It doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. It means it's a popular thing to do.
I would argue that art provides a great sense of meaning and of well-being and of openness. I mean, to say that art is just people go to art because it's a popular thing. I mean.
No, I'm saying that you are offering the observation that lots of people try to derive meaning from religion as if that were a defense of religion. It's not. It's an observation of popularity. To say that this is the correct way to do it and that there's not a better way to do it is a whole different issue from saying this is what a lot of people do.
Well, what I'm claiming is that
people.
What I'm claiming is, spirituality and art, which is connected. Art often plays similar roles in modern culture, and that has been discussed, quite a bit. The way art in modern culture has sometimes taken on the mantle of spiritual aspiration. It certainly did during purely religious times, but now as religion has retreated, formal religion has retreated, art has taken on that role. But both religion or spiritual endeavor and art play similar roles. Again, it's the difference between the creation of meaning and explanation. Science's role within science, within the practice of science, is to offer explanations. Science's role within the broader context of culture acts very similar to art or even to spirituality in offering broad narratives that provide a sense of context and of meaning out of which we draw our sense of ourselves and draw a sense of who we should be.
The problem of letting go of religion certainly applies to letting go of religious explanations. It also applies to letting go of religious morality. It applies to letting go of the admiration on aesthetic grounds of things that weren't really as admirable and would not be able to compete in a fair literary contest held nowadays on grounds of pure aesthetics, but were only promoted to the forefront of the pack because you had to admire them because they were religious. So by saying, well, let's reinterpret the book of Job, you don't say, let's reinterpret Newtonian mechanics. And even to say, let's reinterpret Shakespeare. Let's reinterpret The Merchant of Venice so that it's not anti-Semitic. If you've got, but that is of itself an error of aesthetics. It's throwing the author's original intent and the intended meaning of the book and the most obvious, the most naked, the most visible meaning of the book out the window in order to make it conform to politically correct modern sensibilities that simply shouldn't be applied to which the book simply was never intended to meet.
But that's actually I'm sorry. That's a beautiful example. the book of, The Merchant of Venice, because one sees when that play is done, the director has to deal with both the anti-Semitism and the quality of mercy. I mean, that as often happens in traditions, right? Tradition is very important for us. Attempts to throw it out invariably lead, I think, to disaster, right? Because, what you create...
When we were throwing out the tradition of geocentrism, that led to disaster because we were throwing out tradition?
Not within science, but within the broad broad context of human culture. We are all allowed, to pick and choose the parts, as human culture evolves, the parts that speak to our better angels, as they would say. And, the Merchant of Venice is a perfect example. There is clear, brutal anti-Semitism in it, but there's also great beauty in it. So should we not produce The Merchant of Venice anymore?
We should produce it, but we shouldn't claim that Shakespeare wasn't really anti-Semitic. We should be upfront about the problems that we have with the moral assumptions hidden in the play. We should be clear that the poetry in it is just there as poetry. If people started carrying around copies of The Merchant of Venice with them everywhere, if you found copies of The Merchant of Venice in hotel rooms and people were saying, I'm just going to take out the poetic parts, this would start to be a little bit, creepy. Creepy, that's the word I'm looking for.
Creepy, that's great. But this is like I said, exactly what you're proposing is what happens as within spiritual traditions as they move along. Elaine Pagels, who was the author of the Gnostic Gospels, great scholar of religion, talks about creative misreading. That every generation, creatively misreads.
Creative misreading is just such a wonderful phrase, Bruce.
Isn't it? But that's exactly what happens. I mean, I got there was a pastor in New Jersey who had my book, who gave a sermon about the stupidity of creationism. Right? Now, it was a beautiful sermon, which I completely agree with, because he's talking about all the problems with creationism and all the problems with the fundamentalists. Now, invariably, I'm sure this guy and I are going to disagree, because he's a pastor, right? At Christ Church. We're going to disagree about whether God exists and whether or not Christ was divine. But there is so much in his what he said that speaks exactly to the point I'm trying to argue for, that these documents, the scriptures, have parts in it that are morally reprehensible because that was the time, that was the culture, but also have great beauty and power in them. Now, what I would argue for is in a scientific culture, we can also take the narratives of science and understand how they speak to the same human needs, and they can evoke the same response as the best parts of these scriptures, whether it's the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Dhammapada, any of these scriptures. One acknowledges the part, that's what the evolution of culture is about. One acknowledges that these were born out of cultures that had enormously different values, and acknowledges the racism and the sexism and the horror, but also acknowledges there's a line of human longing, which also is expressed in science, which you can see played through that.
Are you going to give any different treatment whatsoever to The Merchant of Venice and Job?
No, other than to the point of, for myself, these are all great works. What I'm going to acknowledge, though, is that other people will see these as part of a spiritual tradition, and as long as they are not literalist, and as long as they are not dogmatic, and as long as they acknowledge that their way is not the only way, I can allow the disagreement of how they're going to see their book and the power that book has and The Merchant of Venice. Alexa, one of the questions... Go ahead.
The book... Sorry, go ahead. Ask the question.
Well, I was going to say, one of the issues here is how... we're both interested in the evolution of human culture and to develop a more humane, a more sustainable human culture, right? And so
I wouldn't use the word sustainable, but you can. But
okay, well, that may be something we want to talk about, because I think this idea. Because for me, one of the reasons why I'm interested in this subject is that I feel that we are passing through a moment in our evolution where, as a number of people have said, the next 100 years are kind of going to decide whether or not we make it or not, whether the project of civilization will remain viable. And so for me, this is all about climate change and running into the various limits, the ceilings in resources that we have. And science was part of the reason we're in this trouble, and science will be part of the way we get out of this trouble. But it will not be science or reason alone. We will have to change behaviors and decide which kind of science we deploy to deal with the situations we're in, and that will not be done purely for rational reasons. I mean, it will not be, because you can't get the entire world to march one way, or as close an approximation to one way, without bringing into it the mythologies which we already call to, and without calling to spiritual values, what we hold to be sacred, whether that's just seeing the earth as an animate power.
That's why religion was in the forefront of the battle on climate change, and the scientists were not. What?
Wait a minute, I'm not getting you. What that Christian conservatives were? I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, again, and they were also against evolution. I mean, to say that every religious person, by the nature of their religion, thought climate change was false is going a little bit far. And also, again, the point I'm making is that in order to animate the will of cultures, of entire cultures, you're going to have to draw on more than just the science in order to
on more than reality, on more than the facts. Facts are not enough. We need lies to get the world moving.
It's that culture moves not just by facts, not just by cold facts, and you can see that problem happening in the way the conservatives manipulate the climate.
Okay, so we need here something like the Lord of the Rings for climate change.
In what sense? Make a good book. I don't know, but no, it's going to be the development of mythologies for a future, for a sustainable human future, and that in order to draw on to animate the will of entire cultures, that's going to have to draw on more than just scientific explanations. People will change when they see it as part of what they hold to be sacred. Now, actually, Jared Diamond's Collapse. I don't know if you've ever read that book. Beautiful book about why cultures choose to fail or succeed. And he looked at all the reasons why something like Easter Island, why that culture essentially, chopped down all of its trees, and analyzed the different stages in recognizing that you're coming to the point where you're about to collapse. And the last one he held, the most important one, was whether or not societies could change their values, whether or not you could shift your values once you've recognized the problem. And now values are not purely a matter of facts, but you say reality, right? I mean, when it comes to the domains of culture, as opposed to the domains of doing an experiment in a laboratory, how do you beat people over the head to make sure that your reality is the one they accept?
Okay,
right? You have to use other. There's other ways in which people respond to their situation.
May I read a bit from this point from the 12 Virtues of Rationality?
Sure.
Relinquish the emotion which rests upon a mistaken belief, and seek to feel fully that emotion which fits the facts. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is hot and it is cool, the way opposes your fear. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is cool and it is hot, the way opposes your calm. Evaluate your beliefs first and then arrive at your emotions. Let yourself say, if the iron is hot, I desire to believe it is hot, and if it is cool, I desire to believe it is cool. This is said of the second virtue, which is relinquishment. That which can be destroyed by the truth should be. Now, first of all, you may notice that this is a tract on rationality written in a bit of poetic language. I wrote it, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. So I'm certainly aware of the power that poetry, although this is not, like technically poetry, this is more like free verse or whatever the technical term for that would be.
You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Sure. But, so I'm perfectly capable of, using such eloquence as I may happen to be capable of. But if you consider the content of it, to feel rationally is to feel the emotion that fits the facts. You're trying to take emotion off and put it somewhere that runs orthogonal, perpendicular to facts. and it's sort of like, well, anyone by virtue of being eloquent, by virtue of making myths, which to me always sounded like a very dangerous sort of phrase. You can say, well, we're going to give the mythology a technical definition where it doesn't necessarily mean that it's false, but the art that I practice is the art of getting people to feel the emotions that fit the facts, not the art of making up stories that can make them feel any emotions whatsoever, whether or not those emotions fit the facts. And this is the kind of art that I'm trying to build on the foundations of those traditions that have been handed down through science, like the idea of saying oops when you're mistaken and paying attention to reality. And there are alternative traditions passed down through the generations that for generations upon generations have been used to defend and construct upon beliefs that are not in fact true, that were not well justified, that had no tradition of saying oops. And these alternative traditions, I don't think that these traditions are, they're poisoned. I mean, like when I write the 12 Virtues of Rationality, I'm being all poetic and eloquent, but I'm also trying to build a non-poisoned tradition around feeling the emotion that fits the fact.
Well, listen, I completely agree, and I've written on the idea of the ethic of inquiry. That there's, one of the things, especially with climate change, that one has to, one can build, a mythology one can build, is that, what science gives us is a means of evaluating truth statements, and coming to, as best as possible, an understanding of which of the statements is in line with, the reality we perceive. So I have no problem with what you're arguing for. The only problem I would have is that you're saying that clean separation, that emotions somehow that you can sort of cleanly pull apart emotions and reason, because as Nietzsche said, no thought occurs without an emotion.
That's exactly what I'm not saying. I'm saying that this practice of rationality, of arriving at true beliefs, extends out into the practice of feeling the emotions that fit the facts. That you can't say, oh, well, this is going to be the domain of religion and mythology, because if you have a unified practice of building a coherent self, then the way in which you come to accept or reject beliefs of fact is going to flow outward into what you feel as well.
But I guess what the problem is that what I hear you saying is that all that can be known through reason. And aren't there other ways that we know?
Well, how else would you know it?
There are many ways to be human. There are many ways to know. Are you telling me that you're, the experience, again, this almost goes back to the joke, that the experience of that I have before my sick child is one of reason, that what I learn about it as a human, the way I understand about being as a human being, is completely constrained, corralled, completely embraced, with such that there's an isomorphism between rational statements that are built by logic and the totality of human life? I mean, if that's true, then let's get rid of Shakespeare. Who needs Shakespeare? Right? There's nothing in Shakespeare that's worth anything. There's nothing in ballet that's worth anything. There's nothing in any of the other forms of human culture that are worth anything, because really what you have is reason, and that is the only thing which guides us. I mean, reason is one of our... Wait, let me finish. Reason is one of our powers, right? In this, there's the philosopher Isaiah Berlin talks about the difference between hedgehogs and foxes. And the idea is that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And in this way, I think our positions, you're a hedgehog and I'm a fox. Because, to say that reason completely embraces the totality of human experience sounds great. And it's a kind of orthodoxy. But so much slips through it. And that is the reason why it's so hard to get people to embrace reason as a substitute for religion. Is because there's so many parts of us that reason doesn't speak to. So,
okay.
you can wait, let me just put too fine a point on this, right? Because I love science and I love reason and I see its immense articulate precision and its power, okay? But All right, there's the sort of Hegelian idea that you can build this perfect system, this perfect hermetically enclosed system that is, a replacement for the world. This is your analogy of map and terrain. That somehow the map completely can, in some perfect limit, enclose the terrain. It sounds
many
right.
Follow-up questions.
All right. Well, I'm sorry. I just had to finish the whole line there. So it's a hermetically sealed. It sounds right. You have the illusion of sounding right, but in fact, it misses most of a big chunk of being human. I'm done. Go ahead.
Okay.
On.
So let me quickly jump back and ask you, what part of, if the iron is hot, I desire to believe it is hot, and if it is cool, I desire to believe it is cool, or evaluate your beliefs first and then arrive at your emotions. What part of that sounded like my map is more powerful than the territory? And in fact, but that's just the last thing you said. Now I have to sort of work my way back through the stack and try to remember all the other things that were
the hedgehogs and foxes
over here.
Hedgehogs and foxes. The idea that you can create a system of based on reason that sounds like it's going to embrace everything, but in fact, a good chunk of being human, like sand, slides through your fingers.
Okay, well, there just to be sort of like, there I would say, read my blog and read his blog and see which of one of us is the fox and which one of us is the hedgehog. But okay, but I'll leave,
I don't believe in one
aside.
big thing. I don't believe in there's a whole articulate. Being human is messy. Being a human being is fundamentally messy, and we have lots of different ways of approaching and responding to the world. Reason is a beautiful, powerful one of them.
But it is not a coincidence that all these messy little ways of being human tend to be the property of humans and sometimes other primates, and are very rarely observed in fishes, which, by remarkable coincidence, seem much less intelligent and have a generally poorer ability to reason through facts and make complex plans than we do. Everything that we are as humans is built upon the foundation of our map making and our planning abilities to know which actions have which consequences, and by means of modeling the world. All of these other parts of us, they are not in a separate dimension. They are not things that can be torn away from science and handed to religion because these are different buildings, because they're practiced in different buildings. These are things that are integrated into our reasoning abilities and can't exist without those reasoning abilities. And because of that, the choice between rationality and irrationality, the choice between worshiping mysteries and trying to solve them, the choice between reverence, bowing before something, and standing forth to improve on it and do better yourself, the choice whether to revere the past, to look up to the past, or to look up to the future, these choices affect everything that we do as humans and not as fish. And that's why the poison of religion that refuses to say oops can seep into everything it touches.
But first of all, again, you're arguing religion part 1 and part 2, which we both disagree with, which we both reject. Okay?
No.
So it's a straw man then.
The fact that religion's part 2, where they got all of their facts wrong and then built their emotional traditions and aesthetic traditions and experiential traditions upon that basis of bad facts and epistemology can, because we are humans and we are all integrated together, it can poison the aesthetics, poison the emotions, poison the experience.
And also lead to Martin Luther King and Gandhi. Right?
Sorry, what?
Don't forget that the last century, the two great horrors of the last century were not religious. Stalinism and Nazism were not based on, they weren't arguing for a religious principle. They actually were saying that they were reasonable, right? Communism, the huge mistake of communism was the idea that it was going to be a science of history. Reason can be polluted just as much as people saying they have, that they have some kind of spiritual truth as well, right?
Sure.
And so, one other point.
Human thinking in general can be polluted, and religion is only one of many possible ways to go wrong.
Exactly, and religion and reason is only. You talk about human beings as if all we are all that made us different was reason. But the artwork in the caves of Lacan show that there's also this aspect of our responding to the world, and in a way that again creates meaning, in a way that speaks to something beyond ourselves. It's not we're not computers. We're not biological computers.
What I'm saying is that these things require our intelligence and are built upon our intelligence, and that if you poison the facts and you poison the ways of arriving at truth, yes, you can poison that poison can seep into the other parts too. What part of this is saying that what part of this is saying that a purely classical Bayesian rational agent automatically possesses all the elements of human meaning, which I do not assert?
Well, but what I took you as saying is that the only thing which makes humans different from the fish is reason. And there's it seems to me there's a broad spectrum of attributes of being human, which are our defining characteristics. Very much when one looks early on in anthropology, or in the early Neolithic and Paleolithic cultures, the impulse to science, the impulse which would become science, logos, and the impulse of response, which was mythos, were tied together. We pulled them apart recently. It was a good thing that we pulled them apart, but in pulling them apart, we've gone too far, and and in some sense, that is why we've ended up with a planet that essentially our technology has pushed to some limits, and so now there has to be some broader understanding. I think we both agree the idea that we want sort of new mythologies to motivate people, but for me, it's an inclusive
I will not use
mythology.
the word mythology.
Okay, so you want new stories or
new aesthetic reaction to the universe, let's say.
Okay. Well, let's think about that response and that what that response entails. So tell me, what do you think that response for you entails? What is the new direction that you would argue for?
I think it was summarized quite well by a little motivator. I don't know if you've seen those popping around the internet. The caption is atheism. The picture is a single green sprout shooting up in the desert, and the complete caption is atheism. Being alone doesn't mean being lonely. We have each other. There's no higher power, but there's still that green shoot springing up alone in the desert. That is the thing that that my life is to protect. That green shoot.
Oh, okay. So using the word sacred for that, like that your life is to protect. What is the problem with using the word sacred for that? Because you're expressing, again, this is the idea that your meanings are embedded in a matrix of meanings that you inherited, right, from your culture, which speak to, a human tradition of finding exactly that in the world, exactly that sense of the world. Words can change. The meaning of words can change. It's up to every culture to redefine for its own time the meaning of these words. And since so many people find a sense of meaning through that term sacred, especially if you're using it within the context of a scientific narrative, what's the damage? What's the fear in using that word? Because you've already expressed, you just expressed that sentiment. Right, in that green shoot, and the sacredness of that green shoot, it is worthy of protection. It has some extraordinary value. Right.
Right. I treasure that shoot, and I'm not.
Why?
And I can manage to say that without using the word sacred. In fact, it even sounds a bit more fresh and vigorous because I'm not using the standard cliches. You ask what the problem is. Let me quote from the epilogue of The Constant Fire, which is your book. Mm-hmm. Throughout this book, you say, I have spoken of an essential mystery at the heart of human being. I know there will be many scientists who will balk at this, and you're right about that. It may seem to them to be essentially anti-rational or anti-intellectual. In a sense, I think that such a criticism is not unfair. It points to us to the difference between what science does and what powers within us it draws upon. So let me sort of skip over a bit ahead over here. The longing we feel for understanding, the aspiration driving science and spiritual endeavor, will never be satisfied by an equation written on a page or a prescription encoded in Scripture. So let me try to see. How could it be otherwise? We are born and find ourselves... in all cases, it our lived experience that brings us to the boundaries of what is expressible and what cannot be fully framed in words or mathematics. How could it be otherwise? We are born and find ourselves in this incredible world of wonders. After some time, unknown to us beforehand, we pass, and then who knows? It is strange and beautiful, delightfully crazy, and more than a little weird. Therein lies the mystery. Therein lies the opportunity. And now let me sort of swap back to the 12 virtues of rationality.
Okay.
A set of the first virtue, which is curiosity. To feel the burning itch of curiosity requires both that you be ignorant and that you desire to relinquish your ignorance. If in your heart you believe you already know, or if in your heart you do not wish to know, then your questioning will be purposeless and your skills without direction. Curiosity seeks to annihilate itself. There is no curiosity that does not want an answer. The glory of glorious mystery is to be solved, after which it ceases to be mystery. Be wary of those who speak of being open-minded and modestly confess their ignorance. There is a time to confess your ignorance and a time to relinquish your ignorance. Now, one notes, for example, that I use the "there is a time to" and a "time to" trope, which comes from
Very nice. Yes,
Kohelet,
I like that.
Ecclesiastes,
Yeah.
So clearly I didn't mind that. But if you look at your view, you write an awful lot about mystery in your book. And you and I have very different views of mystery. And I think it is because your experience has been contaminated by religious epistemology that was built on not wanting to relinquish mysteries, that was built on not wanting to relinquish your ignorance because then you would have to admit that the religion was wrong. It was built to defend a lie. And if you try to defend a lie, then the truth is your enemy, and every other truth entangled with that first truth is your enemy, and general systematic methods of finding truth are your enemy. And you will want to say, if you begin by wanting creationism to be true, and then you say, well, you can never really know whether or not God designed the world, then you're sort of to say that, to start with that lie, you have to develop a habit of keeping questions open when we do in fact have enough evidence to resolve them, of making a rationalist humility into a refusal to face the facts, to refusal to relinquish your ignorance when the time comes to do so. The practice of worshiping mysteries, like God is an eternal mystery, we can never know it. Well, the fact was they were just sort of making stuff up and poorly defining their words, and they couldn't make any progress on the mystery because the whole thing was founded on a false premise. And so, because they could make no progress, having written themselves into a corner, they worshipped the eternal mystery. And you, in your book, inherit this mistake from religion, and it's a mistake of experience. It's a mistake that says that in the face of mystery, we should not just feel, wow, that's cool, I don't understand it yet.
I'd like to
hold a second. Bow down before it.
So first of all, you're not talking to a pastor at a Christian denomination. I don't know who you're talking to about what you just reeled through about creationism, etc. Because that ain't me.
No,
wait. Let me finish.
Those are.
You're saying that's the dark side of this
that you inherited from. You inherited that tradition of experience, even though you didn't make the original mistake. You drank the poison chalice.
Well, again, now let me read a quote from, our good friend Albert Einstein. The fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands as the cradle of true art and true science. He who knows it not can no longer wonder, can no longer feel amazement, is as good as dead, a snuffed-out candle. Okay? So now you can say, well, he didn't really mean mysterious. What he meant was what I'm saying.
No.
Wait, let me finish. Let me finish. Come on, let me finish. Because this is these are Einstein's words, right? And what he's speaking to is that many scientists feel. When we speak of mystery, when we speak of mystery, okay, what we speak of mystery is, again, at that core of experience. Of that I wake up every day and I find myself in this world and I go seeking my answers. And when I find my answers, I'm overjoyed because in those answers, those scientific answers, I find this beauty in the patterns and the order of nature. And yet every day I still wake up and I'm still faced with the same dilemma. That is what I mean by, that the world is just weird. Now I, as a phenomenologist, or as since I have a predilection to phenomenology, right, as a philosophy. I love their idea that came from sort of existentialism that existence precedes essence, and that existence is this thing we wake up to every morning, and that I wouldn't be happy with any answer, any scientific answer. Because first of all, none exists right now for just the raw presence of existence. Right? Because it's not amenable to an answer. Many things are amenable to answers, but as I said, what equation or what religious dogma or codification actually speaks to that fundamental presence of the world? And this is what Einstein means about mystery, and what sets us onto our scientific careers. To draw closer to that, to unpack as much of it as we possibly can. But again, this speaks to what we were speaking to at the beginning. It is the idea of the hedgehog and the fox. To say that there is a system of knowledge that completely encloses all of human being is a metaphysical stance, right? And it's claiming, this is the important thing, taking a metaphysical stance, right, and holding to it, with tenaciously. That's not science. That's a metaphysical stance. Science is an open-ended dialogue.
I've now repeatedly said that I'm not advocating a single system, or pardon me, not so much not advocating. Let me be more precise in that. I'm not advocating that any ideal Bayesian rational agent encompasses all of human meaning. Having said this before, how many times do you need to say it before you stop accusing me of holding this position?
Because your position is that there's nothing, there is no such thing as mystery. That you're just waiting for answers because
mystery
eventually
the mind.
Well, you're saying that all parts of experience have answers, right? All parts of being human have answers associated with them. And I'm saying
all real things have potential answers associated with them. Not we have those answers already in hand. But mystery is in the mind, not in reality. It's in the map, not in the territory, in cognition, it's in the agent, not in the environment. If I'm ignorant of a thing, that is a fact about my state of mind, not a fact about the thing itself. If I flip a coin and I don't know what it comes up, I said 50% heads, 50% tails. That doesn't mean the coin itself is ignorant. The coin is either heads or tails. Everything real has some particular reality associated with it. And therefore, to worship the mystery of the thing itself rather is to worship your own ignorance. That doesn't mean you can't be curious, but that curious is not an object of worship. Curiosity is not an object of worship out there. It's a drive within yourself to find answers, and to relinquish the part of it where you want to find the answer is to fall into the practice of worshiping the mystery.
But you've already taken a metaphysical stance.
And you quoted Einstein. Let me quote Max Gluckman. A science is any discipline in which the fool of this generation can go beyond the point reached by the genius of the last generation. We've developed better epistemology since Einstein. Atheists have come further out of the closet. We have new notions of rationality. E.T. Jaynes, the great statistician, had not yet stated the mind projection fallacy that ignorance is in the mind, not in the environment. So I say, in this generation, Einstein was wrong. And the fact that I'm allowed to say this, by the way, is part of what separates science from religion. And
absolutely,
not just in terms of the facts, but in terms of the experience and the way you live your life.
But let me speak to something you're saying, because
well,
when you say
we've got 2 minutes left, so we should start summing up over here.
Wow, that's not going to be easy. This is like round 2, right? And we still have miles and miles to cover.
Yeah. I also sort of want to quickly point out that before, when I quoted myself and I quoted you, I wasn't quoting us as authorities, but to compare two worldviews. You actually went off and quoted Einstein as an authority.
Oh.
And I'm not accusing you of any religious chains of thought over here. But never mind. Anyway, sum up. We got to sum up.
Well, by quoting Einstein, I'm showing that scientists who we hold to have enormous power, visionary power, right? And I respect Einstein's visionary power as a scientist. That this is not in any way antithetical to being a scientist. Because in summation, this is what I want to say, right? Is that science And one has to distinguish between science and a metaphysical position that one takes. Science is an open-ended dialogue with the world, and we don't know where it's going to take us. That's the beautiful part. It may take us to places that are going to be very uncomfortable right now. That in terms of what people think science it delimits, right? If this was 1901 and we were talking about determinism and what the world is made out of, people would be freaking out about what was starting out with quantum mechanics. And so, what the important thing to understand is that science will take us places, right, that we do not expect. And it's that essential creativity that is the most important thing about science, not some adherence to a preconceived idea about what is real and what is not real. Because even, as we said, even in that, when you're talking about that there's a map and a terrain, and the terrain has a reality, well, as quantum mechanics shows, we're not exactly clear yet what kind of access we get to that reality. So one should differentiate between one's preconceived ideas of what is real and what science is going to show us we have access to.
Go on.
Go. No, I'm done. There you go.
Okay. And I will say that the long practice of science where people say oops and give up their ideas and you never hear from them again, and people are constantly being tested, constantly being criticized, your old heroes are constantly being cast down, and you're always looking forward to the future, that the rest of the world experience built upon this is very different from the world experience that has been built upon sticking with the same wrong facts for several thousand years. And if you get rid of the wrong facts, but try to keep the traditions, the aesthetics, and the experiences, you are still left with a tremendous difference between science and religion. There, I'm done. And
I'm done.
I guess, yep. Okay, so.
Thank you.